Okay, I'm guessing most of you know that the American Revolution started in 1775, 1776. And if we're thinking about what caused it, obviously we need to go back a little bit beforehand. And while some intellectual historians may go back decades and decades, I think for our purposes, we really want to think about what was going on in really the decade or two beforehand. And so one thing we want to keep in mind is that in the 1760s, there is a large-scale war that happens between England and France, but plays out really across the Atlantic Ocean, including in their territories in the Americas. This comes to be known as either the Seven Years' War or the French and Indian War, and it ends in 1763. The result of this war is largely that the British are successful, which means that British colonists in the Americas are also victorious. They gain a lot of land. Land provides them with access to wealth, which means they become wealthier. And all in, the war is quite expensive too, right? Wars tend to be very expensive. They cost tons of money. There's got to be a way to pay for it. So war ends in 1763. In 1765, the British impose a tax called the Stamp Act. And basically what they say in this tax is, hey, our war gets you a bunch of land. You're going to benefit from having all that land. So you should be okay with us instituting a small tax on documents that helps us recoup our losses from that conflict. Well, in many ways, British subjects who identify as British at this point really don't like this approach. One, because it's a high tax, but even more so, it's not so much the cost or the price of it, that they don't get any say in it. Some of you might be from Washington, D.C., and you know what's on license plates there. The statement, taxation without representation, because Washington, D.C. doesn't have any representatives. Well, in very much the same way, what the British government was doing with this was instituting a law and a tax in the colonies for which colonists weren't able to have any say. So this creates a problem. They're also upset about the fact that the British have left a whole ton of troops in the Americas after the conflict. And because of a strong opposition to this, eventually the Brits back down and repeal, which means that later on, when they try and impose other tariffs, things that are in the textbook like the Townshend Act, which included taxes on imports of paper and glass and paint and lead and tea. More colonists push back against this and see themselves no longer so much as British, but people that the British are taking advantage of. It leads to more organization and protests. Perhaps one that you don't know so well, but hopefully you saw in the textbook, the 1770 Boston Massacre, which is a pretty lousy name considering that only 5 people were killed. Or 1773, the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists in the Americas dump about $1 million worth of tea into the ocean rather than pay taxes on the import of this British good, which gets them all nice and jittery through caffeine. That Tea Party leads to British crackdowns, which leads to the organization of militias, which is something that obviously is important contemporarily in a different way. It leads to the Paul Revere stuff and the war and all the types of things that you can see on History Channel type shows. Rather than thinking about the nuts and bolts of the war itself, what we're going to do from here is really think about, okay, what goes on real quickly in the revolution, but then what are the ideals and what does it get us here?